You're listening to the Thriving Neighborhoods podcast, where systems thinking meets lived experience in the work of community transformation. I'm Kirk Wester-Rivera.
And I'm Markos Wester-Rivera.
Co-founders of Cerco Solutions, a consulting and advising company dedicated to helping social impact and community development organizations drive to greater impact. Every episode, we explore practical solutions for creating inclusively grown neighborhoods, covering housing, education, economic opportunity, community leadership, and more. Through conversations with expert practitioners and insights from decades in the field, we unpack what holistic neighborhood development actually looks like on the ground.
Hello, and welcome to the Thriving Neighborhoods Lab podcast. I'm Markos Wester-Rivera, and today I'm here with my co-host and co-founder, Kirk Wester-Rivera. In episode 2, we talked to Dr. Doug Judy about the neuroscience of neighborhoods, how toxic stress literally reshapes children's brains and bodies. In episode 3, we made the case that neighborhoods are the right scale of change for doing something about it. Today, we're asking, what kind of work actually changes these environments? Most organizations in this space are doing good work. Housing groups build housing, education groups improve schools, workforce programs create job pathways. But here's the problem. All that good work, they're done in these silos. They rarely are working together to add up to transformation. Today, we're exploring why and what it takes to move from outputs to outcomes to actual transformation. The kind that reduces toxic stressors for kids and families, not just treats the systems. So let's get started.
Awesome job. I love that intro.
So there's a progression from outputs to outcomes to transformation. Kirk, can you walk us through what each of those means and why community work gets stuck before reaching the actual transformation?
Yeah, I think oftentimes the vast majority of work that happens in communities is really, it almost happens as a side quest, if you will, because what typically it's sponsored by or driven by is in the housing sector or economic development sector. So you would typically have some type of housing provider that acquired a large amount of land and begins to start to develop that. And in the process of that developing, starts to think about like, I'd say on the best case scenario, starts to think about how, the people that are being most impacted by that development could actually be served by it. Or worst case scenario, they're thinking, well, how can I leverage the people around this to ultimately want to rent from us and help with our, financial stake. And so all of those together, though, ultimately just focus on the outputs of what, in the case of housing providers, almost always when you ask them about what they're holding themselves accountable to, it's how many units of housing is built. In the case of education, it's often how many kids are served and are those kids served well. In the case of economic development, is how many new businesses started or how many entrepreneurs or how many loans are provided. And the really sad part about that is so often they get to a place where they're focusing on a specific geography. So they're buying into that conversation we had in the episode or two ago around why neighborhoods are the right scale of change, but they're not understanding the complexity of what Dr. Judy was talking about, which is what is happening to kids and families with these toxic stressors being piled on them. In that fundamentally takes a different set of partners, it takes a different set of skills, it takes a different mindset in general to be able to really, really get to a place of transformation.
Yeah. So in episode 2, a couple episodes ago, we talked to Dr. Doug Judy about the science of how neighborhood environments create toxic stress for kids. What does it actually take to eliminate those stressors in these environments? Why can't better education programs, whether it's like tutoring or different after school programs, why can't single issue interventions get us there?
Yeah, ultimately it's because we're not single issue people. I mean, I mean, that's the simple answer. And when you think about particularly challenges that we experience as individuals, it's rare that we're just singular modal, right? We have to think about, like, how are we changing lifestyle? How are we changing the resources that we have access to? How are we changing the resources that we can earn or be provided? There's a whole host of kind of pieces to the puzzle that make us human. And when we talk about the transformation in neighborhoods, kind of hearkening back to our conversation with Dr. Judy, essentially what he's describing is that the absence of a lot of assets, the absence of a lot of kind of healthy environmental conditions begins to create toxic stressors. And those toxic stressors, when experienced chronically, in other words, over and over and over and over and over and over again, begins to fundamentally impede healthy, vibrant development in children in particular, but I would say you can extrapolate that in people in general. And so when we try to tackle toxic stressors, if our goal is to eliminate or reduce the impact of toxic stressors on kids' lives or people's lives, well, that takes a multi-pronged approach. That takes a I should say more than just even a coordinated approach, which I know we'll get to in a moment. It takes it goes beyond just having multiple partners and multiple single issue interventions. It's the coordination and the continuous collaborative impact of those multiple interventions that really truly gets us to a place of potential transformation. Because let me just give you an example. So if you are, I mean, this is one of my biggest frustrations, I would say, in the education space. I think that there is broad acknowledgement these days that having just a great school and a great teacher in the classroom is not going to be sufficient to get a kid caught up who's coming in 2 to 3 years behind their middle income peers, right? So there's an understanding that just a great education experience isn't good enough to really get a child over the finish line. However, too often we operate and we make decisions based upon the idea that it is. So when you talk to education systems, they often talk very much about their school district. Very rarely do they talk about that individual school, but they're really talking about their system and how their system can be maximized and made more effective to ultimately get that kid over the finish line. And then off to the side, they'll acknowledge, yeah, but there's a whole host of other problems and challenges that are really being piled on these families and kids that are beyond our control. But rarely does somebody ask the question of, like, okay, so how do we create the structures? How do we create the systems to begin to eliminate all those things so that education can be totally, the quality education of a child can be totally maximized for what it's hoping to yield, which is a child who graduates from high school, ready for college, and able to earn a living wage as an adult. But the problem is they're not alone. All the systems are thinking about that. I've literally been in neighborhoods where a school district or a school itself is really thinking about how to improve what it's trying to do. And then one block down is a development happening with mixed income housing or affordable housing. And then over just even adjacent to the school, there's an early childhood center that is also thinking about that. But none of them are actually, like, getting together and saying, who are we collectively trying to solve for? And how do we ensure that we're creating an ecosystem that addresses the multimodal challenges of what kids are coming in with? And it's really a tragedy, because I would argue that it's that interaction, it's that compounding effect of really trying to wrap around supports around a child that ultimately lead to the outcomes that we want to see, ultimately lead to transformation. And that's kind of the process or progress that we're trying to demonstrate in this podcast, is moving from outputs, which is just creating in the case of housing, just creating housing, to outcomes, which is saying like, well, how do we concern ourselves with the actual human element of why this housing is being created to begin with, to transformation, which is to say, we're collectively concerned about a group of people along with others, and we're trying to really understand the complex nature of what is really needed to evoke that kind of transformation within a group of people.
Yeah. So what I hear you kind of saying is, what you're getting at is that if you're, let's say you have like a housing program, right? And you're at, you're asking this question of like, you might be asking the question of, how in any world could my housing program have any influence or overlap really with, the health or the education of somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we're trying to say is that like there is overlap, right? Or if you're coming from the education perspective, like same question, right? There is overlap, and the overlap there is the client, right? The citizen, the neighbor, the people that you're building housing for, is that they're going to these schools, right? The people that are going to those schools they're going to have health issues, right? It's the same people at the end of the day, and that's the overlap, right?
That's right. Yeah, and I would say that to take it even further, is too often like who you're actually serving has never actually been answered,
Mm-hmm.
right? Housing programs this is pretty common when you talk to affordable housing developers in the nonprofit space. Is they may say that it's a certain group of people within a certain income, but it's almost never a certain group of people in a certain income within this neighborhood, and it's certainly almost never a consideration of like how that housing and how their work could actually be the impact could actually be amplified by partnering really systemic ways to address a whole complex set of challenges that are really impeding the growth of kids.
So if you're a community quarterback organization, or if you're, doing this type of work, how do you get to that place of transformation? That you can get these different groups to work together. Like what strategies have you employed to really make sure that the goals are all the same?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, the question has to be asked is, where are we going to have the most return on investment, and to decide who in fact we're going to serve. So we talked about this neighborhood container, right? But when you think about within that neighborhood, if you're a housing provider, you're a commercial development, like an economic development and entity that's building businesses, or starting up a commercial corridor, or if you're an education provider, ultimately the question is like, let's pull together and figure out where we can have the greatest impact. I have a strong bias towards really understanding the impact that we can have on kids, because it's quite clear from the science that the earlier that we can intervene and engage, and for the longer period of time that we can engage, the better, because we can fundamentally go upstream far enough to actually decrease or totally eliminate the impact of toxic stressors on kids, because we're able to really maintain that set of interventions over time, or the set of that wraparound supports over time. But what ultimately happens is that organizations never collectively, if they get together, that's a big if, Two, if they do get together, they never collectively say these are the group of people that we're trying to impact. And then even if they do get to that point, oftentimes the systems that they've created take over, and they have, there's nothing there to sustain that idea of change, to sustain that idea of impact. In other words, a structure or process in place, then all of those systems go back to operate the way they were designed. So a good case in point is as a very well known and very well regarded housing organization that I worked with one time, essentially decided we're going to do housing development in this neighborhood to really fundamentally be part of the transformation that's happened. Well, the first 10 homes that they built, we discovered only one of those homes had a family from our neighborhood in it. Well, so we had to go back to the housing provider and say, hey, time out. Like what's going on? And even though there's the best of intentions, the system that they had in place was not designed to actually serve effectively or provide access effectively to the families within that neighborhood. So they had to go through and completely rethink how they did their recruitment for their homes. And they also had to completely rethink about how they were actually getting folks to that place of home ownership. Then, ultimately what then happens is if that system is not maintained, if that type of thinking is not monitored, and then we make these assumptions, which is we created these changes, we implemented this policy, and now it's going to be executed with fidelity, and it's going to be executed with the outcomes that we want to see. And you know this to be true, Markos, because you've seen this with some of the clients that we're working with, that there's lots of assumptions that are being made that school over there that we built is actually serving our families, that housing that's being produced, certainly it's serving our families, only to discover actually those assumptions are completely not based in fact. And whenever that is revealed, then the folks typically are compelled to do something about it, because most everybody has the best of intentions, but we have not created the structures by which to reveal the holes in our planning, by which to reveal the flaws in our assumptions. And ultimately what the net challenge that creates is that we end up each serving dramatically different people. We don't get to realize, those individuals nor our organizations get to realize the compounding effects that we could have if we were actually working collectively together towards a common set of outcomes. And we also those organizations continue to do what they've always done, which is to work within their lane. And ultimately they get the outcomes that they've always gotten, which is mostly just outputs versus outcomes. And they certainly don't get the transformation.
Right. So if you mentioned, we're constantly trying to test assumptions that everybody's doing exactly what, we all have the same end goal in mind. We all have, not just that, but also that if we assume such and such thing is being done, we have to make sure that's actually happening. But my question is okay, if you're a community quarterback organization, why not just do it yourself at that point, right? Because then you can easily, keep track of all right, we're doing this, instead of having to go to a partner or something like that, and try to manage, 5 or 6 different interests, or more sometimes. And really you'll be able to get down to the nitty gritty and say, all right, we're going to do these things. We'll be able to measure it. We'll be able to make sure it's successful and all that. Right.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I just want to note is I think you're jumping ahead a little bit. And one of the things that you're jumping ahead on is that you're making an assumption or you're drawing a conclusion that we need a community quarterback. And I believe that is the case, but I think what I'm describing here right now is usually community development corporations or economic development entities, they're all working in silos. And I think what I would say is this is where the conclusion that you're drawing on kind of intuitively is that it ultimately leads to the reason, and the secret sauce to making this happen is an entity like a community quarterback organization. And the reason, we'll get into in our next episode, we'll make the case for what a community quarterback looks like and what it does and why it's so critical. But I think, your intuition is correct, right? Is that it's taking us to that ultimate place. What I know to be true is that is really thinking holistically and systemically taking a systems approach lens to this work of neighborhood and neighborhood development ultimately yields this idea that we can have better and more impactful effects if we compound our interventions, if we compound our work. In other words, that a child, if I can just give you kind of a like end game scenario, that a child grows up maybe in a low income neighborhood, but they grow up and their family is able to get into a stable, healthy housing condition that is affordable to them, and that they're not essentially paying large percentages of their income that puts them, in dramatic financial burden. And then that child grows up in that scenario for the majority of if not all of their childhood into adulthood. And then they go to a school that helped them get into that, that connected them, or they had a communities and schools site coordinator there, or they had a caseworker or something that identified the fact that kid was coming, that kid's family had some housing challenges or safe housing challenges. So help them get into that housing to begin with. And now all of a sudden they are in a neighborhood that also is being connected by an economic development entity who's trying to create situations and retail situations for the child's parents potentially to have best to go over there and maybe start their own business or grow their own business. At worst, have a set of places that they identify with that they can get all that they need within their neighborhood. So if a case in point would be if it's a Latino-centric neighborhood, that there's a panaderia in the neighborhood, that there's a supermercado in the neighborhood, that they don't have to go and search for that 3-4 miles away, because if that's the case, why live there? But all of these systems are working together ultimately to ensure that child that the impacts of toxic stressors are either eliminated altogether or they're dramatically reduced to where that's not. It's like taking a set of weights. I know I'm not a big American football guy, but I've seen frequently where there's this kind of practice of running with a parachute behind you or a set of weights, and the idea, right, is that you're creating resistance so that it creates more powerful muscles in your legs and your sprint power. Well, this is kind of the equivalent of pulling those weights off and allowing you just to run, right, and to run as fast as you can. And so what we're describing here is creating a system that really pulls those weights off of our kids and our families, and does so acknowledging that it's going to take a very system-oriented approach to create that ecosystem to that is focused on doing that collectively. And that's what I'm describing as the compounding effects, and that ultimately has to be held together by some process or some type of infrastructure, and that's where the community quarterback comes in.
I see. Wow. So essentially we're just trying to take the as you said it, like the weights, right? The toxic stressors, the things that are limiting kids, families from growing up to their best potential, right?
Yeah, the fullest potential.
But yeah, and so what sort of, as we're building out that infrastructure to really create that system, right? How do we have to change our thinking in how we fund and how we measure or organize all of this work that we're doing to make these approaches even possible to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great way to kind of wrap up this episode. And I would say that the headline of this conversation today is that we have to be thinking about this in terms of not only how organizations are incentivized and or compelled to work together toward a set of collective outcomes, but understanding that those systems and those organizations' behavior does not change without there being an infrastructure that is constantly helping them move collectively in that right direction. The idea or the idea that somehow organizations, and I can just say this in the context of what I've experienced. I've seen where funders will come to and say, "Hey, I've provided funding to that housing entity. I've provided funding to that education entity. Surely they're working together for better outcomes." And this is a really, really critical assumption that I would just say the vast majority of time, if not almost all the time, is always going to be no. It's always going to be false. The assumption that somehow these organizations are going to just naturally work together for better outcomes, that's not how their systems were designed. And that's not a call out or an effort to bash those providers, those partners. It is just simply saying that almost all of them are going to be serving a lot larger geography than just that neighborhood. And it's going to take them to think about and to critically change certain operational functions that ultimately allow them to see the outcomes that they want to see for the people that they want to see. And that doesn't happen naturally because the systems are designed to get what the systems are doing, the outcome that they are getting, right? And so we have to figure out a way and provide resources. If you're a funder, thinking about providing resources for the infrastructure for that collaboration and that collective impact to happen, thinking about measurement tools that get us to population level change, right? And so, there's and then what are the accompanying processes that leverage those measurements to actually do something about the information that we're receiving? And then some type of entity or infrastructure to scaffold the processes and supports around those entities trying to do work together, so that it's constantly bringing these issues and representing the needs of the people that you're intending to serve to the forefront, and making sure that you're actually getting the outcomes that you aspire to see. And that ultimately is the role that we'll describe in our next episode, which is the role of a community quarterback. But it is a community quarterback, or the term that the collective impact field says is a backbone entity that is really crucial to this work. But the difference between a typical backbone entity versus a community quarterback is a backbone entity usually works with a bunch of partners in a single sector, let's say education, which is the most prominent. Whereas a community quarterback works with a bunch of partners in various sectors to get to a collective end. Much more complicated work, in my opinion.
Thank you all for listening. This has been the Thriving Neighborhoods Lab podcast. This podcast has been brought to you by Cerca Solutions. If you or your organization is looking for support in strategic planning, community quarterback development, or advisement on holistic neighborhood development, we'd love to hear how we can help. Reach out to us at kirkwester@cerca.solutions. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with somebody in your network that's doing this sort of work. Thank you again for listening to the Thriving Neighborhoods Lab podcast.
Thank you, everyone. Next time. Thanks for listening to the Thriving Neighborhoods podcast. If today's conversation sparked something for you, we'd love to hear about it. Connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us at cerca.solutions, that's CERCA.solutions, to learn more about how we support community quarterbacks and organizations committed to high impact efforts. And if you found value in this episode, please share it with someone else working towards thriving communities. Every conversation moves us closer to the change we need. Thanks for listening. I'm Kirk Wester-Rivera.
And I'm Markos Wester-Rivera.
And this has been the Thriving Neighborhoods podcast. We'll see you next time.